I need you to pause everything you're currently doing. Your complete focus is required right now because what I'm about to share fundamentally reshapes everything we knew about the bond between America and its most trusted partner. This isn't a story about import duties. This isn't about trade talks that collapsed under pressure. This is about something far more significant. Something that unfolded in the pre-dawn darkness of a Saturday while tens of millions of Americans slept without any idea what was coming. A financial instrument, the most devastating financial instrument in America's entire economic toolkit, was unleashed against a nation that has stood shoulder to shoulder with the United States through every defining conflict of the past 100 years. And before sunrise arrived, the entire architecture of global finance was already shaking from the aftershocks. If you believe you have a clear picture of what's currently unfolding between Washington and Ottawa, I guarantee you the truth is considerably more alarming than anything appearing in your newsfeed. Let me walk you through this hour by hour, because every detail carries weight. At exactly 3017 in the morning, the United States Treasury Department transmitted a directive to every major American financial institution operating on Wall Street. We're talking about JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, Citigroup, Wells Fargo. Every one of them received this document at the same moment. The directive was written in straightforward language but carried catastrophic consequences. These institutions were instructed to sever correspondent banking relationships with Canadian financial entities within 72 hours, not 72 days, not 72 weeks. 72 hours. That countdown began the instant the directive was authorized. And as I speak to you at this moment, we are already well into that window. What I'm sharing isn't speculation. This isn't second-hand information from an anonymous source with unclear intentions. This is a documented, authorized official directive currently sitting before the most influential bankers in America, and every single one of them is wrestling with how to respond to an instruction that could permanently alter the structure of the global economy. I need to explain something that almost every news outlet is completely failing to convey. Specifically, what correspondent banking actually means for your daily life and for how the modern world keeps functioning. This isn't some obscure financial concept relevant only to people in corner offices. This is the foundational infrastructure that keeps international commerce alive. When I say correspondent banking, I'm describing the essential framework that makes global trade possible. Every cross-border transaction denominated in US dollars, and understood clearly, represents the vast majority of all worldwide transactions, flows through correspondent banking relationships. When a Canadian company needs to settle a payment with a vendor in Germany, those funds travel through an American institution. When a Canadian pension fund wants to acquire holdings in Japan, those dollars clear through New York. When a Canadian traveler is dining in Mexico and uses their payment card, that transaction runs through the American financial network. This isn't about complicating commerce or raising costs or applying negotiating pressure. Severing correspondent banking makes trade physically impossible. It transforms a nation's currency into decorative paper overnight. It renders it genuinely impossible for businesses to participate in the international economy. You don't pressure an economy with this instrument, you suffocate it. I want you to grasp the full historical gravity of what just occurred, because context here is everything. This specific financial instrument has been deployed exactly 3 times in the modern era. The first was against Iran in 2012, a government actively pursuing nuclear capabilities and financing militant groups across an entire region. The second was against North Korea in 2017, among the most repressive authoritarian systems on Earth, a regime that routinely threatens neighboring countries with nuclear destruction. The third was against Russia in 2022, following Vladimir Putin's unprovoked military assault on Ukraine and the subsequent documented atrocities committed against civilian populations. Those were the 3 entries on this list before this weekend arrived. 3 hostile states, 3 international outcasts, 3 nations that the entire democratic world agreed warranted the most extreme available response for their documented violations of international law and fundamental human rights. And now a 4th name has been added to that list. Canada, the country that shares the longest unfortified border in recorded human history with the United States. The country whose forces landed alongside American soldiers on the beaches of Normandy. The country that opened its runways and its private residences to thousands of grounded Americans when commercial aviation was completely halted following the attacks of September 11th. That is the nation the President of the United States just placed alongside rogue regimes at 3:17 on a Saturday morning, and the consequences of that placement will echo through the global financial architecture for years ahead. I need to bring you back in time now, because understanding how we arrived at this morning requires understanding what took place behind closed doors in the hours before that directive was authorized. Yesterday afternoon's developments are the direct cause of what the world discovered upon waking, and the specifics reveal something profoundly troubling about how decisions carrying this kind of magnitude are currently being reached inside Washington. After the Sovereignty Coalition declaration emerged from Ottawa, after the Bank of England made the extraordinary move to open access to Canadian assets, after the defense procurement realignment sent tremors through Pentagon planning rooms, the White House entered a state that people inside the building are characterizing as structured panic. This wasn't the visible variety of crisis management you observe through press briefings and official communications. This was the invisible kind. The kind where the Chief of Staff clears every external appointment without providing any explanation. The kind where the internal communications go silent and nobody with genuine authority is reachable. Multiple individuals with first-hand knowledge of what unfolded inside the residence describe a president who spent the bulk of yesterday afternoon not in the Oval Office where presidential governance normally happens, but in his personal quarters, monitoring coverage across 3 screens simultaneously. He was watching every outlet, tracking every market movement, observing the dollar weakening in real time against every significant currency on the planet. And according to people physically present in that space with him, something shifted in how he carried himself. He became quiet, not composed. There's a distinction that the people around him have developed an instinct for recognizing. This wasn't the stillness of a leader methodically weighing options and contemplating consequences. It was a different kind of quiet entirely, the variety that his closest staff have learned to identify as the signal preceding decisions rooted in wounded ego rather than coherent strategy. At roughly 2 in the afternoon Eastern Time, the National Security Advisor attempted what the intelligence community would characterize as a back-channel communication with Ottawa. This didn't go through the ambassador, which would represent standard operating procedure. It didn't go through the State Department, which would be the appropriate mechanism for exchanges of this sensitivity. Instead, it was routed through a private intermediary, a former Canadian business figure with relationships on both sides of the border, someone capable of delivering a message without leaving official documentation behind. The message conveyed to Ottawa was as follows, and I want you to absorb every word carefully because it illuminates everything about the reasoning driving these actions. The President would entertain what was described as a de-escalation framework, but exclusively if Canada would publicly declare that the entire dispute had been nothing more than a misunderstanding. Allow that to settle for a moment. The President wasn't proposing to eliminate the tariffs that ignited this confrontation. He wasn't offering to return the sovereign assets that had been seized from an allied nation. He was demanding that Canada publicly degrade itself before the entire international community. He was asking the Canadian government to stand before cameras and microphones and describe the freezing of sovereign assets, the activation of emergency wartime authorities against a G7 partner, the economic asphyxiation of a democratic ally, as nothing more than a minor miscommunication between neighbors, an unfortunate accident that simply grew beyond anyone's intention. That was the proposal. That represented the administration's vision of what de-escalation looked like on that Saturday afternoon. The reply from Ottawa arrived in 11 minutes. 11 minutes. You need to appreciate what that interval communicates within the context of international relations, because timing between governments functions as its own form of language. Under normal circumstances, an exchange carrying these stakes and these implications would pass through multiple review layers. It would be deliberated among senior advisors. Every phrase would be considered and reconsidered. The response might require hours or potentially days as the receiving government evaluates its position and examines the implications of each word. 11 minutes is not a response time. 11 minutes is a declaration. 11 minutes is a message transmitted without vocabulary about precisely how Canada assessed the offer being extended. The reply itself consisted of a single sentence. And that sentence will occupy space in the historical record of both nations for generations. It read simply, Canada does not negotiate under coercion. We will see the president at the appropriate international forum. That was the entirety of it. No ambiguity available for either side to interpret favorably. No diplomatic softening that could be spun into something manageable. Just a direct, unambiguous statement that the government of Canada would not participate in its own public humiliation as the price of reducing tension. That single sentence terminated whatever remained of productive diplomatic contact between the two nations. And that single sentence is the precise reason American bankers discovered a Treasury directive waiting for them when they checked their communications this morning. What happened subsequently inside the White House is something I believe the American public has a right to understand fully, because it speaks directly to how the most consequential decisions on the planet are actually being executed. According to three separately sourced accounts from individuals with access to the building, when the president read that one-sentence reply from Ottawa, he spoke exactly 5 words, cut them off from everything. That was the entirety of it. 5 words from a single individual in the middle of a Saturday afternoon. No policy review followed. No cabinet session was convened to examine alternatives and assess consequences. No consultation occurred with national security professionals regarding implications for the broader alliance framework. No examination was conducted of legal authority, international precedent, or potential economic consequences for American enterprises and American workers. Just 5 words from someone whose sense of self could not absorb a single sentence of refusal. And 12 hours afterward, the full machinery of American financial coercion had been aimed at a democracy of 40 million people who have been America's closest partner for longer than any living person can recall. The directive was composed between 6 years in the evening and midnight. We have this timeline with unusual precision because of something that occurred in the early morning hours, something that itself constitutes a historic moment receiving far less attention than it warrants. At approximately 1 in the morning Eastern Time, a senior Treasury official reached a decision that will define their professional legacy regardless of whatever else they achieve throughout their career. This was not a junior employee with restricted access to sensitive materials. This was not some disenchanted temporary worker looking to create disruption on their way out. This was a senior official, someone who has dedicated their professional life to constructing and protecting the integrity of the American financial architecture. Someone who understands precisely what these instruments are designed to accomplish and what occurs when they're deployed irresponsibly. This official reached out directly to a major international news organization. They provided the complete text of the directive, every sentence of it, along with a personal statement that I believe every American needs to hear, because it captures something fundamental about where we stand historically. The statement read, "I have served in the Treasury Department under 4 presidents. I have never encountered a directive this reckless. This will cause irreparable damage to the credibility of the U.S. financial system. I am providing this document because the American people deserve to know what is being done in their name. Understand what that represents." That is a senior government professional effectively ending their own career in order to sound an alarm about what is transpiring inside their own institution. That is someone who examined this directive, read its every provision, comprehended every consequence it carried, and concluded that their obligation to the country superseded their loyalty to any individual holding the presidency. That is someone who recognized that certain decisions are so dangerous, so reckless, so potentially catastrophic that remaining quiet becomes its own form of participation in the damage. When the people operating inside the building are sounding emergency alarms, the danger is genuine. And by the time Asian markets opened for business, the danger was already propagating across global finance in ways no individual or institution possessed the capacity to contain. The Nikkei in Tokyo fell 3% within the opening hour of trading. The Hang Seng in Hong Kong declined 4% as investors absorbed what they were reading in overnight dispatches. European markets followed identical trajectories at their openings. The FTSE in London, the DAX in Frankfurt, the CAC in Paris, every one of them deeply negative before American traders had completed their morning routines. But the real devastation, the figures that should prompt every American to question seriously what is being pursued in their name, those numbers originated from within the American banking sector itself. JP Morgan shares declined 7% in pre-market activity, Goldman Sachs fell 8%. Citigroup dropped 9%. Bank of America, one of the largest financial enterprises in existence, surrendered 11% of its total value in a single pre-market session. I need to explain why this occurred, because it exposes something that mainstream reporting consistently overlooks regarding who actually absorbs the damage when these instruments are activated. The correspondent banking network isn't simply how Canada gains access to American dollars for international commerce, it's how American banks generate massive revenue streams. Every transaction flowing through this system, and we're discussing trillions of dollars in annual volume, produces fee income for the American institutions facilitating it. Severing Canada doesn't exclusively harm Canada. It tears revenue directly from the financial statements of America's biggest institutions. Analysts across major financial firms have calculated that this directive, if executed completely, would eliminate approximately $14 billion in annual revenue from the American banking sector. $14 billion. Because the president spoke 5 words at 2:30 on a Saturday afternoon, American financial institutions now face losing $14 billion every single year for however long this policy remains standing. But the market reaction isn't solely about immediate revenue destruction. It concerns something far more significant for America's enduring position within the global financial order. This is not a single crisis unfolding. What we are witnessing in real time is 4 simultaneous crises converging together, each amplifying the others in ways that are generating a cascading effect that nobody in Washington appears equipped to interrupt. The first crisis is one of dollar credibility. The correspondent banking network rests on a single foundational principle that no regulation or executive order can manufacture as a replacement. That principle is trust. International banks direct their transactions to American institutions because they trust that system to be neutral, competent, and critically non-political. The instant that system transforms into a political instrument, the instant the world sees clearly that a president can weaponize it against an allied country over what functionally amounts to a personal slight, every financial institution globally suddenly carries a fiduciary responsibility to its clients to construct contingency arrangements. Not because they're eager to abandon the dollar framework, but because their clients will require it. Multiple sources report that the European Central Bank convened an emergency session this morning to examine the development of an independent euro-based settlement mechanism operating entirely beyond American jurisdiction. This concept has existed theoretically for years, discussed as a remote possibility, something conceivably happening eventually under particular circumstances. Following this morning, it is no longer theoretical. It has a timeline attached. It has budget commitments. It has political momentum from governments now deeply motivated to ensure they never face Canada's current position. The second crisis is developing on Capitol Hill, and what I'm observing there provides some indication that our institutions retain the capacity to function when circumstances truly demand it. We are witnessing congressional movement not seen since the early Watergate period, when another president discovered that institutional limits eventually assert themselves. 3 Republican senators broke publicly with the president this morning, and the significance of which senators these are requires emphasis. These aren't the customary moderates expected to voice discomfort when situations deteriorate. These aren't members preparing for retirement with no electoral consequences to manage. These are sitting senators representing states with substantial documented economic dependencies on Canadian commerce. Senators whose constituents face genuine devastation if this directive proceeds to implementation. One of them issued a statement destined to appear in historical accounts for generations ahead. It read, "This directive is unconstitutional, unhinged, and un-American. I did not come to Washington to observe a president dismantling our most vital alliance over a personal grudge. That fracture in party solidarity carries enormous significance for what it represents. This transcends ideology. This isn't a cultural flashpoint where each faction retreats to established positions. This concerns economics. And when senators begin receiving calls from the executive donors financing their campaigns, when those donors articulate in precise terms that their operations are being actively destroyed by an anger-driven decision made on a Saturday afternoon, ideology yields to self-preservation. The wall of partisan loyalty withstood 2 impeachment proceedings. It survived multiple indictments. It held through electoral disputes and investigations and controversies that would have permanently ended any conventional political trajectory. But this may represent what it cannot endure, because this is the threshold where American economic prosperity itself faces genuine jeopardy. The third crisis is strategic, and it should alarm every national security professional actually tracking what is occurring. The Canadian Prime Minister announced publicly and with clear deliberateness that he had spoken directly by telephone with the governor of the People's Bank of China. He didn't specify the subject of that conversation. He didn't need to specify it, because the existence of that call alone transmits a signal so unmistakable it requires absolutely no interpretation. The message is this: you are driving us toward your adversaries. Is that genuinely your intention? Consider what that signifies from a national security perspective. Canada, a dependable partner across every security framework protecting American strategic interests, is now engaging China's central banking authority regarding potential financial collaboration. Sources report that the National Security Advisor entered the Oval Office at 5 in the morning carrying a single-page briefing document. The opening line reportedly stated, "Canada has initiated contact with the PBOC. Recommend immediate de-escalation." According to individuals with knowledge of what followed, the president flung that document across his desk and responded simply, "He's bluffing." Perhaps the bluff is genuine, but financial markets aren't treating it as one. Gold reached an all-time record this morning as investors globally sought safe positions outside conventional dollar-based instruments. The Swiss franc surged against every significant currency. Bitcoin climbed 11% within a 2-hour window. These are the assets people acquire when they genuinely believe the global financial framework is fracturing at its foundations. And right now, enormous numbers of sophisticated investors with substantial capital are positioning as though that fracture is underway. The fourth crisis is the one rendering everything else secondary if it goes unresolved. That is the 72-hour window currently counting down with every passing moment. 66 hours remain as I address you now. If this directive isn't reversed before that deadline expires, American banks will begin formally dissolving their relationships with Canadian financial counterparts. And once those relationships are dissolved, restoring them isn't accomplished through a phone call and an expression of regret. The legal structures enabling correspondent banking require months or years to reconstruct properly. Compliance frameworks assembled across decades cannot be rebuilt across weekends. And the trust, the foundational trust animating the entire system, that cannot be restored through a press conference or a diplomatic communique. Once this unfolds, 3 decades of financial integration between the two largest trading partners in the Western Hemisphere will be dismantled across 3 days. Let me describe what was happening in Ottawa while the financial world was still processing the directive's implications, because what the Canadian Prime Minister executed across 6 hours may represent the most consequential sequence of decisions any leader of that nation has undertaken. At 4 in the morning Eastern Time, he convened an emergency session of the Canadian Parliament. Not a cabinet meeting, which would constitute the standard institutional response to a crisis of this weight. A full parliamentary session in the middle of the night. Members of Parliament were roused from sleep. Some arrived wearing casual clothing because the timeline allowed nothing else. The Speaker opened proceedings by noting this represented only the 4th emergency parliamentary session in the entirety of Canadian national history. The previous one was called in the immediate aftermath of September 11th. The Prime Minister addressed Parliament for 12 minutes without prepared notes, without a teleprompter display, simply a person standing beneath fluorescent lighting in the middle of the night, explaining to an entire country what was bearing down on them and what their response would be. He announced 3 specific measures that will permanently alter relationships between North American nations regardless of how this immediate standoff concludes. The first was emergency legislation, designated the Canadian Financial Sovereignty Act, authorizing the Bank of Canada to establish direct currency settlement arrangements with any cooperative central bank anywhere on Earth, circumventing the American dollar entirely for bilateral transactions. This doesn't eliminate dollar dependence immediately, but it constructs the infrastructure making the dollar a choice rather than a requirement. And once that infrastructure is established, it doesn't disappear. The second measure was the Strategic Asset Repatriation Directive. instructing the immediate withdrawal of all Canadian government financial holdings currently maintained within American institutions. Every bond position, every deposit, every reserve balance, approximately $380 billion being removed from the American financial system, not across months, but across days. The third measure was the China engagement, which altered the strategic calculus in every capital across the planet, simply by demonstrating that America's nearest ally was actively investigating alternatives. Sources inside the White House characterized the president as reportedly beside himself this morning, not strategic in his thinking, not methodical. Beside himself, the back-channel attempt requesting a public declaration that everything was simply a misunderstanding tells you everything essential. He isn't managing a geopolitical conflict, he is managing his own ego. He requires a visible public victory, and instead received 11 minutes of silence followed by one sentence of absolute refusal. But institutional machinery doesn't respond to emotional states. The directive went out. The banks received it. The clock continues running. And the professionals inside Treasury who devoted their careers to building American financial credibility are watching it being consumed by 5 words delivered in an afternoon moment of anger. So how does this conclude? Only 2 trajectories exist. The first, the directive gets rescinded. The president reverses course. The immediate relationship survives, but the international community learns definitively that his ultimatums carry expiration dates. The second, the countdown expires. Banks terminate Canadian connections. Supply networks freeze. The dollar's international credibility absorbs a generational wound. And Canada, cornered by circumstance, accelerates engagement with every alternative financial architecture available, not from preference, but because 5 words eliminated every other viable path. What unfolds across the next 66 hours will determine whether the most significant economic partnership in the Western Hemisphere endures or transforms into the defining case study of how America surrendered the international order it constructed. 3 nations occupied this list previously: Iran, North Korea, Russia. History will be left to explain how Canada became the fourth, and whether anyone in Washington possessed the courage to act.